Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. As today we are going to have a look at another one of the Eldar aspect warriors, the Dark Reapers. An aspect that stands out quite dramatically from all of the others, as by and large the Eldar warrior aspects are elegant. They are sleek, they use precision close combat weaponry, or they flit about on their wings like the swooping hawks. Whereas the Dark Reapers, well, their weapon is a fully automatic two-handed missile launcher. A rather abrupt deviation from the theme so far. And that is not by any stretch of the imagination accidental. For you see, when the Eldar warrior aspects were created by Azul men to reflect the various aspects of Kaela Mensha Khaine, he formed the majority of them in his image as the ultimate warrior. Thus, each aspect would take on one of the many facets of being the perfect fighter. But the Dark Reapers were cut from a very different cloth. They were not crafted to be artistic fighting souls. They were crafted from necessity, as their craft world, Altansar, or more correctly the craft world of their founder, Maugan Ra, was caught within the gravity well of the creation of the Eye of Terror. Most Elder craft worlds, of course, were very far away from the cataclysmic events surrounding the birth of Slaanesh. But Altanzar was not so lucky. Unable to escape the unnatural pull of the eye, the craft world was slowly but surely dragged deeper into the warp. Under virtually unrelenting and constant siege for 500 years, the craft world struggled mightily, both in trying to escape the Eye of Terror, even though escaping its pull was at this point already an inevitability. They were merely delaying the end. And the craft world also waged a near continuous war against innumerable legions of the demonic foes, constantly assaulting the craft world. In such a situation, what you need is not an artfully wielded blade. What you need is a very large cannon. And so whilst the Swordsman was training his other brothers in the neat and finessed art of warfare, Maugan Ra spent his time learning how to blow things up. And then, upon returning to his doomed craft world, constructed the biggest guns he could find. He crafted for himself the Maugatar, which is in essence a crew-operated shuriken cannon, which only his own enhanced strength, thanks to his phoenix armor, can operate so easily and accurately, to the point where he can decapitate an enemy from several hundred yards away with a precision shot. Hell, he's probably the kind of Chunibu who could do that around a corner by bouncing the shuriken blade off half a dozen surfaces before decapitating aforementioned enemy. Oh, and he mounted a sickle-like blade at the end. Which I doubt he uses all that often in combat, honestly. The man is carrying around a shuriken cannon. I can't imagine him ending up in close quarters combat that often, but hey, if you're going to style yourself after the Grim Reaper, there's no reason not to give yourself a scythe. And if that scythe also just so happens to be firing ballista bolt-sized shurikens at the enemy, so much the better, really. But weapons like that were not going to be a very practical weapon for the average Eldar. And so those who take upon themselves the aspect of Kaela Mensha Khaine in the form of the Destroyer instead wield Reaper Launchers. These are, in effect, the battery. Granted, the explosive potential of each micro-rocket is not particularly impressive, but their high muzzle velocity and armor-piercing capabilities make them exceedingly good at dealing with hard targets, whether they be vehicles or heavy infantry or, demons whose skin are made out of liquid metal. Altansar's primary enemies for quite some time. And the lack of high explosive effect is made up for by the extreme accuracy of the Reaper Launcher, which is integrated directly with the Eldar operating the weapon via the Wraith-Bone connection that runs through both the weapon and the Eldar's armor. In essence, the Eldar's aspect warrior armor speaks directly to and connects directly to the weapon, to the point where, for all intents and purposes, the two are one, thus allowing the Dark Reaper to see anything the weapon can see, to feel the ammunition, and exactly what path it will take through the terrain. This means that aiming a Reaper Launcher is less an aiming skill, as in pointing and shooting, and more of an instinctual sort of thing, where the weapon itself will seek out enemies to paint on the operator's heads-up display inside of his helmet, informing him of where enemies are and at what angle a shot should be taken to strike that enemy. It is, in essence, a sort of semi-organic super targeting computer. No doubt also easily able to predict the trajectory of an enemy to account for movement. Now that the target acquisition part is taken care of, all that's left is actually firing the weapon. But this too can actually be quite a bit of a problem, and the Dark Reaper's aspect armor is specifically designed to make up for the issues of firing a fully automatic rocket launcher, as the recoil can be rather severe, as it is absorbed back into the weapon rather than simply blown out somewhere like the usual exhaust flame of a rocket launcher. How exactly this works is a little bit unclear, as one would think that would be rather catastrophic, really. And simultaneously, a rocket launcher with a simple, open blowback system would really not have that much in the way of recoil. Although, if you're going to be firing that many rounds, back and forth. Regardless, the Dark Reaper's aspect armor includes several specifically designed firing aids. The arms, for example, can be locked rigidly in place the moment the weapon is discharged. This also is done via the Wraith-Bone connection between weapon and armor, so that only the very instance the weapon is actually fired halts the user's movements, whereas at all other times he's able to move freely. Furthermore, the aspect armor's leg portions are significantly larger than usual, as in the case of the Dark Reapers, maneuverability is not their primary concern, unlike most Eldar aspect warriors. Instead, a solidly anchored point is important. The massive leg armor allows the Dark Reapers the extra weight to lock themselves in place and anchor themselves in the case of repeated automatic firing, and ensures that subsequent shots after the first do not veer away from the target overmuch. This compensation ability is even enough for some Dark Reapers to carry an even heavier variant of the Reaper Launcher called the Torrent. Mechanically, the Torrent is just another Reaper launcher, but with a massively extended magazine, allowing it to keep up a continuous hail of fire for much longer than the regular Reaper launcher. But, of course, this comes at the cost of a significantly increased weight of the weapons system, as all that extra ammunition is not easy to lug around, neither on the weapon itself or on the operator. Efforts are made to minimize this inconvenience with the addition of anti-gravity devices, but it is still a massive and clunky weapon. I mean, hell, the Dark Reaper launcher itself is hardly made for close-quarters combat, but this thing would be like lugging around a canoe, whilst also expecting it to somehow fire missiles. The extra target saturation of the Torrent is, of course, very much so appreciated, but it does share one key drawback with the Reaper launcher, namely that both of them are direct fire weapons. These micro-missiles are, well, not really so much missiles as they are literal rockets. They can be aimed with a tremendous amount of precision, and the close link between the weapon, the operator, and the armor means that each missile can no doubt be given certain corrections, both pre and in flight, but by and large, it is a big, dumbfire rocket launcher. Thus, unless it can actually draw a direct bead towards a target, it's not actually going to be able to hit it. No indirect fire capabilities, and no ability to fire around complex terrain. There is, however, a variant that allows for this to occur: the Tempest Launcher. The Tempest is significantly more complex than the standard Reaper or even the Torrent, which is basically just a Reaper with a larger magazine, and the Tempest is thus reserved solely for the Exarchs of the Dark Reapers. This weapon has a far more cantankerous spirit, and can only be handled by the most expert of operators. But in return, it gains the ability to see targets outside of the usual line of fire, to sense enemies behind cover, behind hills, or hiding behind various obscuring terrain. The Tempest can track them and send targeting data to the micro-missiles, allowing them to, in essence, arc over the intervening terrain and strike targets hiding behind it. This is obviously an enormous advantage, particularly in certain scenarios, but otherwise the Dark Reapers would be in deep doo-doo, like urban environments, where a big, heavy, clunky, difficult-to-wield rocket launcher would normally be a massive inconvenience. But if you can see the enemy through a wall, and then tell the rockets to zip through a doorway or a window, and then curve to hit the target, a weakness no longer. This additional maneuverability, however, does come at the expense of the payload, as each individual missile now, rather than really rockets, carry a lot less oomph than those fired by the standard Reaper launcher. In an effort to compensate for this, and understanding that making the projectile faster would defeat the entire purpose of its additional homing abilities, the Eldar instead decided to focus the Tempest Launcher on area of effect, giving it a small fragmentation warhead instead. Again, this means that it's significantly less useful against armor or heavy infantry, but it can function very well against ensconced infantry. And seeing as the rest of the squad of Dark Reapers will all be carrying the standard Reaper launcher, if anything, the addition of a dedicated anti-infantry weapon is a good move for the squad overall. But usually the Dark Reapers do not want to be hiding behind cover or fighting in an urban environment. They are heavy support units and should ideally be deployed as such. They have heavier armor than most aspect warriors, although still somewhat modest by the standards of most races. They're able to weather a fair bit more firepower than most of their brethren. They need to be able to do so because once anchored in place, they're not going to be getting out of the way of incoming firepower. Again, the primary defense of your average Eldar, an aspect warrior, is not in the thickness of the armor, but in the Eldar's near preternatural ability to get out of the way of incoming rounds, even if just enough to avoid a direct hit, allowing the armor to deflect the energy rather than needing to just absorb the energy. For the Dark Reapers, this is not so much an option, and so they have a massively reinforced central piece of armor, which also houses their spirit stone in case the worst were to happen, and their massively reinforced legs too, housing all of the various systems that anchor them in place, can also help soak up a fair bit of damage. They are by no stretch of the imagination indestructible, but they're a fair bit tougher than your average Eldar. And their primary means of defense, of course, is not taking the enemy's fire, it is annihilating the enemy before they can focus an adequate amount of fire. As the best way of defending yourself against getting shot is simply removing anything that could potentially shoot at you. And in that role, the Dark Reapers excel. They can climb up on a strategically important hill somewhere and lay down an absolutely devastating amount of firepower on anybody trying to dislodge them from that hill. This is a crucial part of Eldar maneuver warfare, because whilst it might not sound like this is a particularly useful part of maneuver warfare, it absolutely is. Both for pinning the enemy in place so that more maneuverable aspects can flank around and destroy the enemy without suffering their full weight of firepower before doing so, but also to allow other parts of the Eldar host to maneuver freely. If the Dark Reapers can occupy a certain position and make it virtually suicidal for the enemy to approach, then that is an area in which the Eldar can move freely, without the fear of getting plapped from long-range enemy weapons as well. The Dark Reapers also are experts in a field of warfare that the Eldar would usually prefer to avoid: siege warfare. The Eldar's failing numbers means that they really do not want to commit themselves against fortified positions unless absolutely inevitably necessary, as near no amount of simple speed and finesse is going to make up for the fact that your opponent is sitting in an armored bunker with a heavy machine gun. And short of bringing up Bright Lancers, which are usually rather vulnerable crew-operated weapons, or the mighty D cannons, which would certainly deal with the bunker line very, very effectively, or some of the Eldar's precious few heavy hover tank vehicles, there aren't that many ways that the Eldar have of dealing with fortifications. The Dark Reapers provide a solution to this problem, where the Dark Reapers are both mobile enough to move through complicated terrain that might otherwise severely inconvenience their weapons platforms or even their hover tanks, whilst also being small enough to not be quite so easily detected. The Dark Reapers can move into position and assault a fortified enemy bunker with an overwhelming amount of blitzing firepower before the defenders know that they're even under attack, and keep up that firepower for long enough to keep the defenders very, very much so interested in hugging the floor of their bunker, and not so much up on the parapets shooting at the incoming Eldar assault teams. In extreme situations, given enough time to do so, the Dark Reapers may also themselves be able to break open fortified positions, though that would require a significant ammunition expenditure, and for the Dark Reapers to be staying out in the open a lot longer than they'd be comfortable with. As again, the Eldar aren't really about single units doing singular things, but cooperative assaults. And the Dark Reaper's abilities should be seen in that light, in their ability to directly support other specialized aspect warriors, protecting them against enemy heavy armored threats, protecting them against large formations of enemy infantry, and creating no-go zones in which the enemy cannot operate freely. It also doesn't hurt, of course, that they are probably the premier infantry carried weapons in the entirety of the Eldar arsenal to deal with, those things. Greater demons and that sort of stuff. The kind of shit that all too often roams the battlefield just as maneuverable as infantry in the Warhammer 40,000 universe and tends to pop up at the most inconvenient of times. Not to mention those times that the Eldar need to engage with Chaos or Space Marines, armies that employ a whole ton of heavily armored infantry, or the Tyranids. An enemy that quite unfortunately possesses both overwhelming numbers and a dangerous amount of heavily armored creatures as well. It was certainly in part Maugan Ra's personal, direct involvement that saved the craft world of Liandon from being devoured by the Tyranid menace. Oh, and that does bring me to one other part of Eldar warfare the Dark Reapers technically, theoretically excel in, but that the Eldar really don't ever want to be engaging in, and that is defensive positional warfare. Now, those two words usually indicate that something has gone incredibly wrong for the Eldar, though, and they don't want the Dark Reapers to occupy that position for very long, if ever. Because if the Eldar have been pinned down to the point where they must rely on raw firepower to defend themselves, then the Eldar are about to be in for a very, very, very bad time. The kind of bad time that usually results in them needing to rely primarily on their dead ghost warriors to continue to survive afterwards, if there is a surviving afterwards. So, whilst a heavily armored aspect warrior carrying around a ginormous automatic rocket launcher might seem like just the ideal thing to place in an area to keep the enemy from getting in there and ruining all of the Eldar's stuff, and, well, again, whilst that is definitely, certainly true, it is the absolute last application of the Dark Reapers that the Eldar would ever like to see. This is partially also why the Dark Reapers don a death face mask. Both because they are indeed the image of Kaela Mensha Khaine as the Destructor, as the bringer of death and annihilation, but also because they know that if they are ever called upon in the defense of their craft world, then a lot of Eldar are going to die as well. And with all that, I hope you've learned something new about the Dark Reapers. As I, as always, of course, have been Arch, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.